Thank you very much. My name's Leah Cohen. I am a policy advisor in the mayor's office in New York City and have been working on resilience for the last couple of years. And then since Sandy, I've been part of this initiative that I'm going to talk about today, which is called the Mayor's Initiative on Rebuilding and Resiliency. And it's the city's long-term response to rebuilding the most impacted communities in the wake of Sandy, but then also thinking about how we can make the city more resilient to a full range of climate effects. So just to get started here. All right, so I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of what the city's been doing on resilience, talk a little bit about the three questions that have been posed to us by the mayor, what happened during Sandy and why, talk about some of our findings, then talk about what could happen in the future and the full range of risks that we're preparing for, and then the most important question, which is what is the city planning on doing about it? All right, so just to place this a little bit in context and to tell you a little bit of a personal story of how I came to this. My colleague Levon and I had worked for about a year in the mayor's office working with a bunch of infrastructure operators, thinking through sort of in a much more theoretical way how we start to plan for the full range of climate risks that we're facing the city. And then October 29th, came, we were mobilized as part of the mayor's energy team to go sit in the Emergency Operations Center for about 6 weeks, pretty much night and day. And so, you know, we were there really in the Situation Room with the mayor the night of the storm when we had just seen sort of all these worst case scenarios that we'd been thinking about really come to pass. We had lost complete connection and situational awareness of what was going on in the rest of the city. And I think that started this real journey for us of moving from what had been sort of a stakeholder engagement process, a process that was a little bit more of a planning exercise, into how do you start to really deal with these things from an emergency response perspective, from a rebuilding perspective, and then ultimately thinking long term. So this slide just kind of shows you the context of the evolution post Sandy. We had basically the preparation leading up to the storm. We then had a lot of the emergency relief and response work that was going on right after the storm. I personally was made responsible for coordinating delivery of generators throughout the city. So working with all of our public housing authorities, our vulnerable residents, our populations that were living in assisted living homes, and trying to figure out how to restore power to them, how to get them food and water. Once we moved out of that, we really started to focus as a city on the immediate recovery. So how do we start to make sure that people have places to live, that we can start to get, you know, all of the debris out of the way and really start the recovery and rebuilding process. And then this very last bucket is sort of the work that we've been doing since December as part of this special initiative on rebuilding and resiliency, to really think longer term about how we address the full range of climate risks facing the city. Okay, so this is just to say that there's been a lot of work that's gone on in New York City. We weren't starting from scratch. As I mentioned, Plan YC, the mayor's sustainability plan, which was launched in 2007, put a process in place to start to understand what the climate hazards were facing the city. We convened a group of climate scientists modeled off of the IPCC, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, to help us understand what our local hazards were in the future. And then we set in motion a process to work with our infrastructure operators and understand what were the different strategies that we needed to be taking to reduce risk to critical infrastructure. So that was all before the storm. We'd had a significant head start. You can see from this slide here, in 2007, we were actually thinking about a lot of the things that happened during Sandy in pretty much the same terms. So what this slide shows you is a red dotted line. That's the theoretical flood heights that of the flooding in Holland Tunnel, which is a vehicle tunnel in New York City. if you got a really big coastal storm. And this is about what happened during Sandy. So at the beginning of December, the mayor sort of called us all back from the Emergency Operations Center and said, you know, we really need a much more comprehensive, much more accelerated effort to start to think about how to increase the resilience for the city. And he tasked us with doing 3 very specific things. We were charged with answering sort of what happened during Sandy and why, so that we could start to really understand what some of the potential solutions would be. The second question was what were the future risks facing the city, not only in terms of coastal storms, but the full range of hazards, including heat waves, winds, sea level rise, et cetera. And then the most important question was, what do we do about that? How do we rebuild the city in a way that makes us more resilient? So we brought on a very large team of people to help us with this accelerated effort. The head of our Economic Development Corporation, Seth Pinsky, was asked to step away from his job for 6 months. Meanwhile, we brought on a group of 35 different professionals to just work full-time. And so we've got a bunch of different groups. I head up the climate analysis group, which is the group that's feeding all of that climate hazard information into our planning process. And that information is being used by a group of folks that are focused around the infrastructure and built environment, so every single different critical infrastructure system in the city, as well as the communities that were most impacted by the storm. And then, of course, we have a pretty robust outreach process. We've been spent the last 6 months really hitting the pavement, so to speak, and going out to different communities. We've had a series of round robins with all of our elected officials, community-based organizations, a whole set of public workshops, as well as a bunch of different advocacy-based organizations. And we are set to deliver in pretty short order this report, which should be coming out in the next couple of weeks, which is going to be the city's comprehensive response to Sandy. So now to move on a little bit to some of our findings. So what happened during Sandy and why? So as many of us in New York know, Sandy was a pretty unique storm. That was a confluence of a bunch of very specific types of factors. What you can see on this slide is Sandy, by comparison with other storms, was a very large storm. This is the wind field to the right of Hurricane Sandy. You can see that the gusts extended about 1,000 miles. By contrast, Hurricane Katrina, which, as we all know, hit the Gulf Coast a number of years ago, had a wind field only 300 miles across. In addition, Sandy did something very unusual. What you can see here up in the left was due to a kink in the jet stream. Basically, whereas most coastal storms that we get in New York City really veer off to the right and head out into the Atlantic, Sandy was blocked from doing that. And it took this, what has now become in the US, a very, very famous left turn, you know, heading straight on to New York City. And that put us in the path of what are called the storm's onshore winds, which are the most dangerous winds. And among other things, led to a really record-breaking storm surge. We had about 14 feet of surge. It was about 30% higher than the previous high record that was set in the 1960s. In addition, another unique thing about Sandy was its timing. What you can see here at the top is basically the chart. The colors show water levels. So, you know, purple and blue are low water levels, leading up to, you know, yellow, orange, and red, which are high water levels. What you're looking at right here is basically the Atlantic coast heading into the Upper Harbor in New York City. And you can see the top two slides are showing you that high tide was coming in to the southern part of the city around lower Manhattan just before the storm. And then you can see on these lower frames the surge coinciding with the tide, leading to those really record water levels that we saw in lower Manhattan and the Atlantic-facing areas of the city. At the same time, because we were in the path of these onshore winds, as everyone knows, hurricanes move counterclockwise. And so as the storm started to head towards us, the winds started to shift direction, and that caused an intense amount of wave action along these areas that you see along the Atlantic that aren't used to getting that kind of wave action. That led to a very specific set of impacts. So what you can see on this slide in the bottom here, you can see what are circled are essentially what we call our red and yellow tagged buildings. Essentially, it's our Department of Buildings went out after the storm and assessed which buildings were substantially damaged as a result of that wave action. And so you can see that a lot of these southern coastal areas of the city were the areas that had a lot of that really significant damage because of the wave action from the storm. Whereas by contrast, if you look up in the upper harbor, that's a sheltered area. We had much more still water flooding, which led to a very specific set of impacts. In that case, mostly our buildings had flooded basements and damaged electrical and boiler equipment. So what could happen in the future? So as I said, Sandy was a unique combination of a bunch of different factors. And so in terms of predicting the next storm, it may not have a lot of value, but it did serve to remind us that we are, as a coastal city with more than 520 miles of coastline, extremely vulnerable. And what you can see here is basically the federal government in the U.S. Develops these flood maps for insurance purposes that are designed to indicate what our flood risk is. And the maps that you see here that we had in place in the city were developed a very long time ago in 1983 and were significantly out of date. But even the out-of-date maps show that we have quite a lot of things in New York City that are at risk. Over 220,000 residents and about 200,000 jobs. Sandy showed that we were really even more vulnerable than we thought. So what you're looking at right here is the blue is that 100-year floodplain as our federal government had mapped it in 1983. The red areas are the areas that were flooded by Sandy. And the reason that this is really important is because the areas that are in our 100-year floodplain have flood protection standards tied to them. So what it meant for flooding to extend far beyond our floodplain is that a lot of the buildings that were flooded didn't have any sort of flood protection standards in place. They weren't built to any sort of standards, and you saw a lot of the damage out there. Then in the wake of Sandy, our Federal Emergency Management Agency came in because we had very out-of-date maps. They worked with us to develop a set of advisory maps so that we would have better information to inform our rebuilding process. What you can see is that the updated advisory maps that they came out with here, what you're seeing in the dark purple and sort of the grayish violet is our new 100-year floodplain based on these maps. We were seeing a really significant expansion. We've got almost 2 times the number of residents. It's more than any other American city. We don't have the numbers up here, but we also, by population density, have more people living in our floodplain than any other city in the U.S. We've got almost 350,000 jobs, so there's really a lot of things that are at risk in New York. But I think it's important to remember this is a plan not just about Sandy, not just about coastal risk, but about the full range of risks. So the maps that our federal government has developed, they're only backward looking. They only take historic data into account. They don't say anything about the future risks from sea level rise or possible changes in coastal storms. They also don't consider any of the other things that we know are at risk of today, like heat waves, drought, which has a pretty obvious impact on our water supply, and heavy downpours, which we get quite often. And the picture that you're seeing up here on the left was a rainstorm that managed to shut down our subway system in 2007. So to think about all of those other risks, what we've done, as I mentioned earlier, is convene this group called the New York City Panel on Climate Change, which is a body that's modeled off of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have been charged with advising us on the latest climate science. In 2012, because we realized how important this function was, the mayor actually passed legislation codifying them and requiring them to provide us with regular updates to make sure that we had the latest science to inform our planning process. And then you can see that it's a bunch of the leading institutions in our area are represented. A lot of them serve on the IPCC as well. So they came up with, in 2009, a set of climate projections for both extreme events, and the extreme events we think about in New York City are storm surge, heavy downpours, and heat waves, and then also the more gradual changes or mean annual changes like sea level rise and changes in precipitation. As part of this special initiative process, we reconvened the NPCC and asked them to develop updated projections. And so those new numbers are going to be coming out shortly with the launch of our report. So just kind of to summarize, you know, we've always been vulnerable to coastal flooding as a city. Sandy really taught us that we were more vulnerable than we realized. That was confirmed by a lot of the work that our federal government's been doing to help us map our risk. You know, the climate scientists are helping us understand how those risks are going to be changing in the future. And then some work, which I didn't include here actually, that we've been doing with Swiss Re is helping us to understand that there's a real cost to inaction. So what should the city do knowing all of these different things? So as I mentioned, we've been working on a pretty comprehensive plan to answer those 3 questions that the mayor posed to us and do it on 2 levels. And so what you see here is basically the table of contents of our report, which is going to be coming out pretty shortly. And so we have a whole set of chapters that are focused on increasing citywide resilience for the full range of built environment as well as critical infrastructure systems. And so we're going to be having a chapter on each one of these things, you know, from coastal defenses to thinking about different aspects of the energy sector, as well as, you know, hospitals and healthcare. And then the second sort of area where we're trying to answer those questions is developing those community rebuilding and resiliency plans for those 5 impacted communities. And this is really sort of looking at how do all the things that we want to do for different critical systems, how do we put them together into a plan that helps us rebuild in a better way in these very specific community contexts. And so for those areas, you know, we're looking at a lot of the coastal facing areas like Staten Island and Brooklyn and southern Queens that were impacted by a lot of that wave action that I was talking about earlier. And then we have our sheltered water bodies, the Brooklyn, Queens waterfront, and southern Manhattan that will be getting their own very specific plans. So for each one of these, each chapter is going to include basically a set of performance standards that help us understand how these systems should be performing during extreme events, as well as in adjusting to this changing environmental baseline. And then laying out really a set of regulatory recommendations for achieving those standards, as well as a set of investments. And so one additional thing that I should have mentioned is that you know, we have the benefit of a lot of funding coming from the federal government in the wake of Sandy. And so a lot of this plan actually is going to be tied directly to the federal funding that's coming in. So most of it, a lot of it has been funded. So I don't want to spoil the surprise of the next couple of weeks when you get to open the plan yourself, but I'll just talk with you a little bit about sort of some of the principles that we've been using in our planning process. So the first thing is that we're trying to be ambitious but achievable. You know, we're trying to make real strides in terms of reducing our risk, but also making sure that whatever we come up with is very implementable. And you know, one effort is making sure that each of the initiatives in the plan is actually very tied to a set of funding sources. The second thing is that what we're trying to do is to make it sounds like we have a lot of money coming in, but actually when you start to look across New York City, and all of the development that we have, it's really sort of a drop in the bucket in terms of what needs to happen. So we're trying to really maximize the resources that we have and make them stretch as far as possible. And in our case, one of the biggest things is that, you know, like many other cities in the northeastern United States, we're an older city. And so we have a lot of existing development. And so we have a lot of hard decisions to make about how we increase resilience for a lot of building stock that was built without any of the conditions and hazards that they're facing today. And then the third thing is that we're focused on being multi-layered. I think as opposed to you know, trying to climate-proof the city, our idea in New York is that it's about redundancy. And so we're trying to sort of create multiple layers of protection in terms of looking more at our coastal defenses, but then also thinking about what we can do to retrofit our building stock. And also look at our critical infrastructure system. So it's going to be a full mix of strategies, not just, you know, a coastal defense versus, you know, retrofitting buildings. And then the last thing is a few of the goals and principles for the community's work. So, so in terms of the principles for how we approach this, I think we're thinking mostly about rebuilding what was lost, but trying also to use this as an opportunity to address a lot of the existing issues. And a lot of the communities that were impacted, you know, there were significant economic challenges already, and we're trying to think about this really as an opportunity to make these communities stronger and more resilient, not only in a physical sense, but also in an economic and social sense. The second thing that we're trying to do is really use a lot of these areas as laboratories to innovate and test out different ideas about what works and what doesn't in different contexts. And then the last thing is, you know, these will really, as I said earlier, kind of put together all the different pieces in the citywide resilience plan to come up with an integrated package that makes sense for that particular community. And then one other thing, final thing that we're doing is looking more actively at ongoing local business recovery, which has been a big challenge in the wake of Sandy. So that's a very, very quick tour through our soon-to-be-released plan. You can check it out on planyc.gov.